One evening in the early 1950s, a family in St. Louis opened their windows to let the summer air in. The city felt ordinary. Children played outside. Radios hummed inside kitchens. Streetlights flickered on as dusk settled over brick houses and factory smoke. Nothing about that evening suggested history was being written in the air itself. No sirens, no warnings. No announcements, just a quiet mist drifting invisibly across parts of the city. For the people breathing it in, the particles meant nothing. They had no smell, no taste, no color. Life continued exactly as it had the day before, but miles away, men with clipboards and military insignia were watching carefully. Instruments recorded how the particles moved. Wind patterns were charted, distances were measured, notes were taken with scientific calm. To them, this wasn't a neighborhood, it was a test field. To understand why this happened, you have to go back to the fear that defined an entire era, the Cold War. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union entered a silent conflict built on paranoia, nuclear weapons, and worst-case scenarios. Military planners weren't only worried about bombs falling from the sky, they were terrified of something more subtle. What if an enemy released radioactive or biological particles over an American city? What if the attack wasn't loud? What if it was invisible? How would the particles spread through streets, rooftops, alleyways, ventilation systems, schools, hospitals? How many people would be exposed? How fast? And perhaps most frightening, could the government even predict it? These weren't abstract questions inside military offices. They were treated as urgent national security problems. Because in the logic of Cold War strategy, the only safe country was the one prepared for the worst. So the U.S. Army launched a series of classified urban dispersion experiments. The official purpose sounded clinical, to understand how airborne particles move through dense city environments, but the execution required something deeply uncomfortable: real cities. Real neighborhoods, real people who would never know they were part of the experiment. St. Louis became one of the selected locations. On paper, the choice made sense to planners. It had varied terrain, dense residential blocks, industrial zones, and a large urban population, exactly the kind of environment analysts feared might someday face a biological or radiological attack. To scientists designing the tests, it was a perfect model. To the residents living there, it was simply home. The material used in several of the tests was a fine powder known as zinc-cadmium sulfide. Military researchers described it as a tracer, something visible under special detection methods that allowed them to track how particles dispersed in the wind. At the time, officials considered it safe in the quantities released, but the crucial detail was this: the public was never informed. No town hall meetings, no newspaper notices, no consent. The experiments were conducted in secrecy because military leadership believed disclosure could create panic, or worse, reveal strategic vulnerabilities to foreign enemies. So instead, the operations were framed internally as harmless simulations. From rooftops, from vehicles, sometimes from dispersal devices placed in urban locations, fine particles were released into the air. And somewhere in the city below, ordinary people inhaled them without ever realizing anything unusual had happened. For many residents, the 1950s were years of optimism. The war was over. The economy was growing, suburbs were expanding, television sets were appearing in living rooms, trust in government institutions was high. Few imagined that hidden experiments might be unfolding above their neighborhoods. Military reports from the era focused heavily on data. They tracked how wind corridors formed between buildings. They observed how particles collected in certain districts. They measured how long materials remained detectable. One conclusion became especially important. Dense urban housing could trap airborne particles far longer than expected. From a defense standpoint, that was critical information. From a civilian standpoint, it raised a terrifying implication. If the particles stayed longer, then exposure would too. But at the time, these findings remained classified, stored inside technical documents few outside defense circles would ever read. Years passed, the experiments faded into archived files, personnel changed, Cold War priorities shifted. Life in St. Louis moved forward, families relocated, children grew up, neighborhoods evolved. Factories closed, new highways cut through old districts. For decades, almost nobody outside government channels spoke publicly about what had happened, until the 1990s. That's when investigative journalists and researchers began uncovering declassified documents, describing Cold War testing programs conducted on American soil. Among them were references to dispersion studies in St. Louis. At first, the information sounded technical, almost boring: aerosol testing, particle tracing, urban airflow studies. But when reporters began connecting the language of those documents to the reality of what they meant, the story transformed overnight. This wasn't just laboratory science. This meant substances had been released in populated areas, without public knowledge, without consent, without long-term health monitoring. The revelation stunned many residents, especially those who had lived in the affected neighborhoods during the testing years. Community meetings filled with anxious questions. What exactly had been released? Was it truly harmless? Did anyone study the health impact afterward? Could decades-old illnesses be connected? Officials responded cautiously. Military representatives reiterated that zinc-cadmium sulfide had been considered safe at the levels used. They emphasized that the tests were designed only to simulate particle movement, not to expose citizens to dangerous materials. But scientific understanding evolves. Later researchers pointed out that cadmium compounds can be toxic under certain conditions, particularly with prolonged exposure. Even if the concentrations used were low, the idea that entire neighborhoods had unknowingly been part of a military experiment unsettled many Americans. Because the issue was no longer only about chemistry, it was about trust. Could the government conduct secret tests in civilian areas? Had it happened elsewhere? Were there other experiments still unknown? For older residents of St. Louis, the discovery created a strange emotional conflict. The city they remembered as safe, the streets they walked as children, the playgrounds, schools, bus stops, all might have been inside an invisible testing zone. Not because anyone wanted to harm them personally, but because, in the calculus of Cold War planning, protecting the nation sometimes meant studying the population itself. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer something became. St. Louis was not the only location involved in Cold War dispersion testing. Other American cities had been used in similar studies, but St. Louis became one of the most widely discussed because of the scale and the population density involved. As public awareness grew, lawsuits followed. Advocacy groups demanded transparency. Scholars analyzed military ethics from the era. Historians debated whether the tests reflected necessary preparation or unacceptable risk. No simple answer satisfied everyone. Because the truth lived in a gray area between fear and responsibility, from the perspective of military planners in the 1950s, the world seemed dangerously unpredictable. Nuclear weapons existed. Biological warfare was feared. Intelligence suggested enemies were developing new delivery methods. Preparation felt urgent. From the perspective of civilians decades later, the idea of being unknowingly exposed to experimental materials felt like a violation of basic rights. Both realities existed. And that tension still shapes how the story is told today. Yet one question remained hauntingly unresolved. If the government believed these tests were safe, why were they kept secret? That question would lead investigators deeper into Cold War policy decisions, classified communications, and internal debates, revealing a mindset shaped by something stronger than scientific curiosity. A mindset shaped by the belief that the next war might not begin with explosions, but with something drifting silently through the air. That fear shaped nearly every military decision in the early Cold War years. To understand why secrecy felt justified to officials at the time, you have to imagine the psychological climate of the 1950s. Nuclear drills were practiced in schools. Families built backyard fallout shelters. Newspapers printed maps showing how far blast zones could reach major cities. The idea of an invisible attack wasn't science fiction. It was considered a genuine possibility. Military planners believed that if a hostile nation released biological or radioactive particles over an American city, the first hours would determine everything. How fast would the material spread? Which neighborhoods would be most exposed? Could evacuation routes even work if contamination was already in the air? Without real-world data, they were guessing. And guessing, in their view, could cost millions of lives. So the logic inside defense circles became brutally simple. The only way to protect American cities was to understand exactly how airborne materials behave inside them. Wind tunnels and laboratory models weren't enough. cities were chaotic, buildings created unpredictable air currents. Rooftops, alleyways, and industrial smokestacks changed airflow in ways simulations couldn't fully predict. They needed real urban data, and that meant real urban testing. Internal documents from the era reveal how planners discussed these operations. The language was technical, almost detached. Words like population exposure appeared not as warnings but as variables. Neighborhoods were described as sampling zones. Apartment clusters became collection grids. The people living there were rarely mentioned individually. Not out of cruelty, but out of institutional distance. When organizations operate at national security scale, human lives often appear only as statistics. Incent. Louis dispersal equipment was sometimes placed on rooftops of public buildings or mounted in locations where airflow would carry particles across large residential areas. Monitoring stations were positioned to track how the tracer spread over time. Scientists watched the data come in. They observed that particles moved farther than predicted. They noted that certain low-income housing complexes experienced higher concentration levels due to their architectural layout. This finding was especially valuable to military analysts. If a real attack ever occurred, these densely built neighborhoods could face heavier exposure than wealthier districts with more open spacing. From a defense perspective, that insight could help shape evacuation planning. From a social perspective decades later, it raised an uncomfortable question. Did the testing disproportionately affect poorer communities? At the time, that question wasn't publicly asked. Because at the time, the public didn't know. For residents, life continued normally. Parents sent children to school, workers clocked into factories, churches filled on Sundays. Baseball games played in the summer heat. History unfolded above them, unseen. The Cold War eventually shifted focus toward nuclear missile strategy, satellite surveillance, and advanced weapon systems. Urban dispersion experiments faded into older files, overshadowed by new technologies. Many of the scientists involved moved on to other research. Many of the officers retired. Many of the records remained classified, and as the decades passed, memories of the testing faded even among those who had participated in it. Until declassification began pulling fragments of the story back into public view. Journalists investigating Cold War programs in the late 20th century started noticing repeated references to something called simulated biological agent releases conducted in American cities. When those phrases were translated from military language into plain English, their meaning became far more startling. Simulated releases meant substances had been intentionally dispersed. American cities meant civilians had been present. The reaction among the public varied. Some people were furious, others were strangely unsurprised. Because by the 1990s, trust in government secrecy had already been shaken by earlier revelations, intelligence surveillance programs, unethical medical studies, and other Cold War experiments. The St. Louis testing became part of a larger national conversation. Where is the ethical line between preparation and violation? If leaders genuinely believed they were protecting the country, did that justify withholding information from the citizens they served? Or does democracy require that even national security planning remain transparent? There were no easy answers. Public health experts examined available data to determine whether the tracer materials used could have caused long-term harm. Some studies suggested the risk was extremely low at the exposure levels estimated. Others argued that uncertainty remained, especially regarding repeated dispersal events. But science alone couldn't settle the emotional side of the issue, because the deeper wound was psychological. People want to believe their homes are safe places, that their government protects them, that their neighborhoods will never be used as experimental grounds. Discovering that history might say otherwise creates a kind of quiet unease that statistics cannot erase. For many residents, the hardest part wasn't proving whether the particles caused illness. It was realizing that the decision to conduct the tests had been made without them. Consent is powerful. Its absence is unforgettable. Former residents interviewed years later often described the same feeling, not rage at first, but disbelief. You mean they tested something here? You mean we were part of it and never knew, and nobody ever told us afterward? That final question lingered the longest. Because even after the Cold War tensions eased, there had been opportunities to disclose the experiments voluntarily. Instead, information surfaced mostly through investigative pressure, document requests, and gradual declassification. Some officials defended the secrecy by pointing out that revealing the tests earlier might have created public panic or exposed military vulnerabilities during a dangerous geopolitical era. Others countered that withholding the truth for decades eroded public trust far more deeply than honesty ever could have. The debate remains unresolved even today. Historians now often teach the scent. Louis testing as part of a broader pattern of Cold War domestic experimentation, a period when fear of external threats led institutions to take actions that might not be considered acceptable under modern ethical standards. Looking back, it's easy to judge, but the people making those decisions lived in a world where nuclear war felt not hypothetical, but imminent. And in that world, preparation sometimes overshadowed transparency. Still, as investigators continued examining documents, another unsettling realization slowly emerged: the dispersion tests in St. Louis were not isolated experiments conducted once and forgotten. They were part of a much larger national testing framework, and that meant the question was no longer just what happened in one city. The real question was far broader: how many American communities had unknowingly lived under the same invisible clouds? That question changed everything, because once investigators realized St. Louis was only one piece of a much larger Cold War testing strategy, the story stopped being local, it became national. Declassified military archives began revealing references to dispersion experiments across multiple parts of the United States. Coastal cities, smaller towns, transportation hubs, even subway systems in some locations had been used to study how airborne particles might travel through real civilian environments. Each test had its own technical name, each report sounded clinical, but together they painted a picture that felt far more human than scientific. A country preparing for the worst by quietly studying its own population. In Washington, officials from earlier decades had justified these programs using a simple but powerful argument. If the United States didn't understand how biological or radiological agents spread in cities, an enemy attack could cause catastrophic loss of life. From their perspective, gathering this knowledge wasn't optional, it was survival. Yet the scale of the testing began to trouble historians who examined the documents years later. Some experiments involved releasing tracer materials from ships offshore to observe how particles drifted into urban areas. Others used ground-based dispersal systems positioned in densely populated neighborhoods. The goal was always the same: measure the wind, track the spread, record the exposure pattern. And every time, ordinary people lived their daily lives beneath the drifting data. By the late 20th century, investigative reporters started tracking down individuals who had lived in St. Louis during the testing years. Many were elderly now. Some barely remembered the details of that era beyond ordinary childhood memories. But once told about the experiments, their reactions often followed the same quiet pattern: first disbelief, then confusion, then a slow, heavy pause. Because when history suddenly tells you that your childhood neighborhood might have been part of a military test, the past shifts under your feet. Some residents began connecting memories that once seemed meaningless: a strange powder scene on windowsills, occasional unusual activity near public buildings. Vehicles parked in odd places with equipment they didn't understand. Most of those memories were uncertain. Human recollection is fragile, especially decades later. But emotionally, the idea that something invisible might have been happening nearby was difficult to shake. Community meetings held in later years sometimes became deeply emotional. Parents asked whether their children had been exposed. Adult children asked whether their now-deceased parents might have unknowingly lived through the tests. Doctors were asked whether certain illnesses could be linked, and again, the answers rarely satisfied everyone. Because proving long-term health effects from low-level exposure decades earlier is extraordinarily difficult. Scientific studies depend on measurable data, and much of that data simply didn't exist anymore. What did exist, however, was documentation confirming that the tests themselves had taken place. And confirmation alone was enough to reshape public perception. The Cold War had always been remembered as a conflict fought with spies, missiles, and diplomatic standoffs. Now it also looked like a conflict that sometimes unfolded quietly inside American neighborhoods. For scholars of ethics, the St. Louis case became a powerful teaching example. Not because it involved deliberate harm, there's no evidence the planners intended to injure civilians, but because it demonstrated how easily institutional logic can override individual consent. Inside military planning rooms, the tests were framed as defensive preparation. Inside civilian homes, had people known, the same tests might have felt like involuntary participation. That gap between intention and perception became the heart of the controversy. Some former defense officials later explained that they truly believed the tracer materials posed minimal risk. They argued that without real-world testing, the country would have remained dangerously unprepared for biological warfare. Others acknowledged that even if the physical risk was small, the ethical cost of secrecy was enormous, because secrecy changes how history judges decisions. An openly announced experiment invites debate, a hidden one invites suspicion. As public awareness spread, legal challenges emerged. Advocacy groups sought compensation, medical monitoring programs, or at minimum full disclosure of all Cold War domestic testing activities. Government agencies responded with partial document releases and official statements summarizing the purpose of the experiments, but by then, the emotional damage was already done. Trust once shaken rarely returns fully intact. For many Americans, the revelation fit into a broader realization that the Cold War had pushed governments around the world into morally ambiguous territory. Leaders faced threats they believed could end civilization. Under that pressure, some decisions prioritized national survival over individual autonomy. Whether those decisions were justified remains a question historians still debate. In St. Louis itself, the city moved forward as cities always do. New generations grew up without direct memory of the testing era. Neighborhoods changed, old industrial zones transformed. Schools taught modern history that only briefly mentioned Cold War domestic experiments, yet the story never vanished entirely. Researchers continued studying archival materials. Documentary filmmakers interviewed surviving residents. Universities held panels examining how Cold War secrecy shaped modern ethical standards in science and defense. Because the real legacy of the St. Louis tests wasn't just about particles in the air, it was about the relationship between citizens and the institutions meant to protect them. Governments require trust to function. Citizens assume that decisions affecting their safety will involve them, or at least inform them afterward. When that expectation breaks, even decades later, the psychological impact spreads far beyond the original event. It changes how people view authority, how they interpret official assurances, how they react to future emergencies. Some historians now argue that Cold War experiments like those in St. Louis indirectly helped shape modern transparency laws, research ethics boards, and public consent requirements. In that sense, the controversy contributed to stronger protections for future generations. But that doesn't erase the past, because history is not only about outcomes, it is also about experience. And for the families who lived through those years unknowingly participating in a national security study, the experience was defined by something deeply human. They were never asked. As investigators continued digging deeper into Cold War archives, one final realization began to emerge, a realization that would turn the St. Louis story from a historical controversy into something even more unsettling. The experiments hadn't only been designed to understand how particles move. They had also been designed to understand how a population reacts when it doesn't know it's part of a test. And that revelation would force historians, ethicists, and ordinary citizens alike to confront the most uncomfortable question of all, not whether the government could run secret experiments, but whether, in moments of fear, any nation might convince itself that secrecy is the safest path, even when that secrecy drifts quietly through the air above its own people. By the time that realization settled into public discussion, the Cold War itself was long over. The Soviet Union had collapsed. Nuclear drills were no longer routine in schools. The fear that once justified extraordinary secrecy had faded into something historians could analyze instead of something citizens had to live with. But the questions left behind did not fade so easily. In the early 2000s, as more Cold War records became accessible, researchers, journalists, and public interest groups continued digging through archives. They weren't only looking for technical data anymore, they were looking for intent, for the mindset behind the decisions. What they found painted a complicated picture. Internal memos from the era rarely spoke about civilians in emotional terms. Instead, they framed entire urban populations as environmental variables. Wind patterns, building density, and population distribution were treated as elements in a defensive equation. The goal, consistently repeated, was preparedness, not experimentation for its own sake, but preparation for a potential biological or radiological attack that military planners believed could come without warning. Inside that framework, secrecy wasn't considered malicious, it was considered necessary. Officials feared that if citizens knew tracer materials were being released in their cities, public panic could erupt. Worse, they worried adversaries might learn what the United States was studying and adjust their own strategies. From the perspective of those planners, silence protected both national stability and strategic advantage. But from the perspective of later generations, the same silence looked very different. Because decades later, the absence of consent felt more significant than the presence of justification. Public hearings eventually revisited several Cold War domestic testing programs, including the dispersion studies connected to St. Louis. Experts testified about the materials used, the quantities released, and the known toxicological data. Some concluded that the health risk was likely minimal. Others emphasized that uncertainty remained, especially for vulnerable populations or repeated exposure scenarios. Yet again, science alone could not resolve the deeper issue. Because the controversy had never been purely medical, it was moral. The core question was no longer, did the particles cause harm? The question had become, should citizens ever be unknowingly included in such tests at all? That debate reshaped how modern governments approach research involving human environments. Today, strict ethical review boards, environmental impact disclosures, and informed consent policies exist partly because earlier eras demonstrated what happens when such safeguards are absent. In that sense, the invisible clouds over St. Louis helped shape the visible protections people rely on today. Still, the human side of the story remained the most powerful. For elderly residents who had lived through the 1950s testing years, the revelation often felt strangely personal, even decades later. Some described feeling like their childhood memories had been quietly rewritten. Streets they once remembered as ordinary suddenly carried an unseen historical weight. A playground was no longer just a playground. A schoolyard was no longer just a schoolyard. Each place became part of a larger narrative they had never known they were inside. Younger generations, hearing the story for the first time, often reacted with disbelief. Not anger immediately, disbelief. Because the idea challenges a deeply rooted assumption that events affecting entire populations are always announced, always explained, always visible. The St. Louis tests showed something different. Sometimes the most significant events leave no immediate trace at all. No explosion, no siren, no headline the next morning, just data quietly recorded and filed away. Historians now frequently describe Cold War domestic testing as a reflection of its time, an era defined by existential fear, rapid technological advancement, and a belief that preparation justified extraordinary measures. Leaders genuinely believed they were defending their country against threats that could arrive silently and devastate millions. Yet history also teaches that fear reshapes ethical boundaries. What seems necessary in one decade may feel unacceptable in another. That shifting perspective is what gives the St. Louis story its lasting power. It forces every generation to ask the same difficult question: where is the line between protecting a nation and protecting the rights of the people inside it? Because those two goals are supposed to be the same, but history shows they don't always feel that way in the moment decisions are made. Today, St. Louis stands like any other American city: busy highways, modern schools, new neighborhoods rising beside old brick buildings. Most residents go about their lives without thinking about Cold War dispersion studies or archived military reports. And yet the story remains, preserved in documents, documentaries, and academic research, not as a tale of villains and victims, but as a reminder. A reminder that history's most important lessons often arrive quietly. A reminder that trust between governments and citizens is built not only on protection, but on honesty. And perhaps most importantly, a reminder that the most powerful forces in history are not always the ones you can see. Sometimes they are the invisible decisions drifting silently above ordinary lives, because the legacy of those Cold War tests is not the particles that once moved through the air. It is the awareness they left behind, an awareness that preparation must never erase transparency, that security must never